This is a complete service video including replacing axles, bearings, and the free hub for the Garda DS. The procedures are the same for the Garda version 1 and 2. If you are not confident working with bearings, take it to a shop. It's very easy to go too far and damage your brand new bearings. If in doubt, support your LBS. The front wheel is relatively straightforward. There are two end caps held in place by grub screws. The axle is sandwiched between two bearings. Tapping that through will allow you to change the axle or the bearings. Note that tapping a bearing out always puts force through the inner race. This can lead to damage in the bearing, so we always recommend that you use a fresh, new bearing every time. For the front wheel, the tools you will need are a 2mm Allen key to remove the grub screws, a tool to pry the end caps off, as well as a 17mm socket to act as a drift against the outer race of the bearing as we drive it home. Because the axle is made from aluminum, I like to use a rubber hammer or wooden mallet to remove it, and a metal hammer to tap it in. So we need a way to knock this through without damaging the axle. The way we're going to do this is in two stages. First, we'll tap this down, push it through, and then that will give us the room we need to get a tool in there to pry off the end cap. Now I'll tap that through. And there's the axle and the bearing. Now I can tap out the remaining bearing using a heavy tool like an Allen key or a screwdriver. So now we're ready to replace the first bearing. I will take my 17mm socket, line it up with the outer race of the bearing, and I'll use a steel hammer, which gives me better control. At first, I want to use just light taps. I want to make sure it's going in straight. Once it's gotten a little bit deeper, I can use a little more force. I want to be careful I don't drive it in too far, so once it starts to get close, I'm going to use lighter taps. Now I'll replace my axle. But I'm going to need a support. So I will use another socket on the bottom and make sure it lines up with the outer race and use that as the platform. So I'll get my fresh new bearing and I'll put it in place, ready to be tapped in with the 17mm. So I want to make sure it has no play and also spins smoothly. If that's okay, I'll put the end caps back, and of course, remember to tighten up the grub screws when you're done. And give it a final test. It's good. I'm ready to move on to the rear wheel. For the rear wheel, as with the front wheel, the bearing must be tapped out to get at the axle. On the rear wheel, you also need to do this to change the Freebody. The tools you will need are two 17mm open-end wrenches, one of which must be a narrow type. For replacing the bearing, you'll also need a steel hammer and an 18mm socket. Inside the hub, the Freebody threads into a nut, which is actuated by a long type 12mm hex fitting. We'll use one for a 1/2-inch drive, compatible with a long breaker bar and our torque wrench as well. The torque wrench should be capable of 58 foot-pounds or 79 Newton-meters. Now we have all our tools in place, let's get working. The rear wheel uses lock nuts to keep things in place, so we need to get those off to get started. Because it's a little difficult to access the inner nut on the drive side, this is the side we're going to need to work on first. We'll do that by bracing the inner nut on the non-drive side to release the outer nut on the drive side. So now we're going to release the outer nut on the non-drive side by bracing the inner nut with the narrow 17mm, loosening the outer nut against it. Now the axle is free to be tapped out. We will tap out from the drive side to the non-drive side, because once we remove this bearing, we will be able to access the nut inside and remove the free body. You can use a wooden mallet or a rubber hammer, but you can also use a steel hammer as well, since the axle here is steel and there's less danger of damaging it. So we're going to tap this out and we're going to do it from the drive side. Note that there is a long side and a short side for the axle. The long side is the non-drive side, the side we just tapped out. If you rushed ahead and tapped the axle out from the wrong side, the bearing will have come out from the free body. Not to worry, it shouldn't cost you too much to replace it, and you can tap it back in using the same methods shown in this video. Now we are able to fit our 12mm hex tool. This is going to take some elbow grease, so you may find it easiest to put it on the ground and secure it between your legs and feet. Once it is free, you are ready to prepare the replacement free hub. Thread it in and tighten it with the torque wrench to 58 foot-pounds or 79 Newton-meters. Now all we need to do is put the axle back in and replace the bearing. As before, this won't work. So we're going to need to support it with some scrap wood or another socket. I've got some spare wood available, so I'll use that. Take my fresh bearing, my 18mm socket, and I'll line that up with the outer race. I'm going to use my steel hammer, starting with just light taps, making sure it doesn't skew on its way in. Once it passes the edge here, I'm going to use lighter taps so it doesn't go in too far. I'm going to check it for play and make sure it still rolls smoothly. That feels pretty good, so I'm going to build it back up now. The lock nut system allows for some fine tuning, but it's easy to over tighten, so adjust things very carefully. Because we can only make adjustments on the non-drive side, we're going to start on the drive side here with the free body. And I'll start with the inner nut. Just finger tight is fine. Now the outer lock nut. Again, just finger tight. Now I'll flip it around and work on the non-drive side, starting with the inner nut. Don't tighten the inner nuts too much, as this will make it stiff and you will need to start over. Now put on the outer nut. Tighten the inner and outer nuts together firmly. Then finish up by gently tightening the two outer nuts together. Be careful not to over tighten. And now that feels smooth. Now I'll give it a final spin test. It feels good, so it's ready to go back on the bike and ride.